12. They called it a divorce, but what happened in Nashville felt more like an unmasking. Keith Urban's stiff, awkward answers about now ex-Nicole Kidman started circulating online, and suddenly the story wasn't about paperwork. It was about what people believed had been hidden for years. Nicole filed after 19 years, and the transcript frames it bluntly. The filing was only a formality, because the real collapse happened long before any signature touched a court document. The narrative opens with a theme that keeps tightening like a noose. A marriage can look perfect from the outside, while quietly turning one partner into the other's caretaker. Nicole's voice enters with the kind of line built for a headline. She says she's been silent for too long, that at 58 she has to speak up for herself, and that the truth about their marriage can't be contained by the phrase irreconcilable differences. The story immediately establishes the contrast between image and reality. Red carpets, applause, the golden couple myth, versus private exhaustion, sleepless nights, and the feeling of living in a relationship where love slowly became duty. Dates are used like scene markers. On July 15, 2025, she signs divorce papers at Nashville Family Court, a cold legal sentence that doesn't even pretend to describe what she says was 19 years of effort and heartbreak. The court grants a 45-day period to reconsider, 45 days that the script treats as a prison sentence for the heart. Nicole waits in their London home with their daughters, Sunday Rose and Faith Margaret, watching the phone for a text or a call from Keith and getting nothing but silence. In this telling, the silence is not neutral. It's the loudest proof that the decision was made long ago. On September 28, 2025, she walks into the courtroom under heavy rain, and the transcript paints it like a funeral procession for a marriage, doors opening, the judge calling names, the shift from Mr. and Mrs. to two separate surnames. The legal title Kidman versus Urban, turning love into a case file. Then comes the ritual that makes it feel final. She takes the stand, places her hand on the Bible, and swears to tell the truth, the whole truth. At that moment, she realizes there is no return to the fairy tale version of their life. She rewinds to how it began. Meeting Keith in January 2005, believing it was destiny, marrying on June 25, 2006 in Sydney in what the world called a fairy tale ceremony. But she insists the fairy tale was already rotting from the inside. Her lawyer places documents on the table, photos, articles, printouts, contracts, transforming memories into exhibits. Nicole draws a line that defines her entire position. She didn't file because of a vague incompatibility. She filed because she lived in a marriage where she was forced into the role of savior, carrying the weight while the man she loved remained the one who needed saving. And standing there, under the eyes of the court and millions watching through screens, she isn't speaking only to the judge or to Keith. She's speaking to herself, finally admitting that whatever love they once had, she can't keep sacrificing her life to hold the illusion together. If part MOT was about the public unraveling, part high becomes about the private imbalance that Nicole claims began almost immediately after the wedding. The turning point, according to her testimony, wasn't one explosive fight or one shocking betrayal. It was the moment she realized she had married not just a man, but a crisis. Just 4 months after their June 2006 wedding in Sydney, she says she had to check Keith into the Betty Ford Clinic. Instead of settling into newlywed bliss, she found herself managing addiction, protecting reputations, and learning how to smile in front of cameras while privately terrified. In her framing, that early intervention permanently shifted the dynamic of the marriage. She stopped being a partner and became a guardian. She describes herself as a warden, a nurse, someone constantly monitoring moods, triggers, and temptations. Love, she suggests, quietly turned into supervision. Keith's response in court pushes back hard against that narrative. He does not deny addiction. He admits rehab, relapse, and struggle. But he emphasizes sobriety, nearly 2 decades of it. He insists he rebuilt his life, stood on stage sober, raised his daughters sober, and worked relentlessly to provide stability. His argument is not that he was perfect, but that redemption matters. How long? He asks, does a man have to pay for his worst chapter before he is allowed to be seen as changed? To him, being eternally defined as the addict she saved is another form of imprisonment. In that clash lies the emotional core of this chapter. One partner believes the past never truly left. The other believes he outgrew it. But Nicole's account suggests sobriety did not restore quality. She claims the imbalance created in those first months lingered. She says she carried the emotional labor of maintaining the image of a flawless marriage. Every red carpet became choreography. Every interview required careful answers. She describes whispering reminders before stepping into public view. Smile. Don't let them see. Whether that was literal or symbolic, the implication is clear. She felt responsible not only for her own composure, but for his stability. Another fault line emerges around identity and pride. Keith reportedly struggled with the public nature of Nicole's acting career, especially intimate film scenes that ignited media chatter. He argues that he never tried to control her, but he cannot deny feeling humiliated when audiences sexualized his wife and mocked him in the process. He frames that pain as deeply personal, being reduced to the husband while the world analyzed her body on screen. Nicole counters that her work is her calling, that acting is not provocation but purpose. She says she refused to shrink herself to soothe his pride. In her version, he wanted containment. In his, he wanted dignity. The transcript presents a marriage slowly transforming into a negotiation of egos and insecurities. Neither denies love existed, but both describe feeling unseen. She says she felt burdened and alone in responsibility. He says he felt publicly diminished and privately criticized. Arguments escalated, silence deepened, and silence, in their opposing narratives, carries different meanings. For Nicole, his silence was abandonment, evidence that she was fighting alone. For Keith, silence was restraint, an attempt to keep private matters from becoming spectacle. This chapter also introduces the idea that long marriages rarely collapse from a single catastrophe. Instead, they erode. Emotional distance widens quietly. Small resentments calcify. Pride replaces vulnerability. Nicole suggests she forgave many times but felt each forgiveness carved something out of her. Keith suggests he changed, grew, and was still being judged for a version of himself that no longer existed. By the time the divorce papers appear, the story implies the separation had already happened internally. The courtroom simply formalized what years of imbalance had already established. The deeper tragedy in this phase of their story is not addiction alone, nor career jealousy alone. It is the accumulation. A dynamic where one partner feels like a rescuer and the other feels like a perpetual suspect cannot remain equal for long. And so the narrative tightens, not yet about betrayal or violence, but about identity, about what happens when love becomes obligation, when admiration turns into resentment, when pride competes with vulnerability. Part High makes one thing clear. Before any alleged scandal surface, the foundation was already cracked. By the time the narrative reaches its third act, the tone shifts from imbalance to rupture. What began as emotional asymmetry now becomes, in Nicole's telling, a pattern of betrayal that permanently fractured trust. The transcript escalates carefully. First addiction, then insecurity, and now infidelity, each layer building toward the claim that the marriage was not simply strained but structurally compromised. Nicole anchors this phase of her testimony to a specific date, March 12, 2012. She says she was in Berlin filming The Paperboy when a late-night call disrupted her sense of stability. A friend claimed Keith had been seen in a Nashville bar with a young blonde singer, an unknown artist attempting to break into country music. At first, she dismissed it as gossip. Hollywood marriages, especially high-profile ones, are constantly shadowed by rumor. But by morning, she says, tabloids had published photographs. Images of Keith holding hands with the woman circulated online, and speculation erupted instantly. The transcript dramatizes the confrontation. Nicole calls him. There is silence. When he returns home, she describes an explosive argument. Newspapers thrown, accusations hurled, denial followed by partial admission and then retreat. In her recounting, Keith minimized the situation. Alcohol, a mistake, nothing meaningful. But for her, the damage was not about whether it meant something. It was about humiliation. Public humiliation layered on top of private insecurity. She recalls asking what it felt like to watch the world consume her shame in real time. Keith's perspective, as presented in court, complicates the narrative. He does not fully confirm the affair in the way tabloids would prefer. Instead, he frames the situation as exaggerated by media distortion. Touring life, industry friendships, alcohol-fueled misunderstandings. He implies context matters. He admits imperfection but rejects the portrayal of serial betrayal. And yet, even in defense, there is acknowledgement that loneliness had crept in. He describes feelings secondary to her filming schedules, her scripts, her long stretches abroad. In his words, he felt abandoned before I abandoned her. That line becomes pivotal, because whether accurate or defensive, it reframes betrayal as reaction rather than origin. Nicole hears blame shifting. He hears emotional neglect. And between those two interpretations lies the widening canyon of resentment. Forgiveness may have been offered, but the transcript makes clear it was not healing. She says she forgave but never forgot. Each reconciliation left a residue. But infidelity, according to Nicole, was not the darkest chapter. The most controversial element of this testimony emerges when she describes physical intimidation during a 2015 incident following the CMA Awards. She alleges that after returning home, with alcohol involved and tensions high, a confrontation escalated. She claims he grabbed her arms and pinned her against a wall during an argument fueled by jealousy and wounded pride. She says bruises formed on her wrists, concealed the next morning by bracelets that the press praised as fashion statements. This is the moment where the transcript stops being tabloid drama and becomes a moral fault line. Keith categorically denies being an abuser. He admits arguments. He admits losing his temper, but he rejects intentional physical harm. He concedes the possibility of grabbing too forcefully in the heat of conflict, but insists it was never violence in the predatory sense implied. The distinction matters enormously, and the transcript deliberately leaves it unresolved. Nicole's explanation for her silence adds psychological depth. She says she feared public exposure would permanently damage their daughters. She feared being labeled a failure, an Oscar-winning actress who could not maintain her own household. She feared the spectacle more than the bruises. In her framing, silence was survival. But survival came at a cost. Each unspoken incident deepened her internal fracture. The transcript suggests patterns: late-night returns from tours, text messages discovered, hotel bills questioned. It does not provide independent corroboration. It provides emotional accumulation. That accumulation is strategic. Because even if one allegation can be disputed, the weight of repetition creates atmosphere. The marriage begins to resemble a loop: suspicion, confrontation, denial, apology, reconciliation, relapse. Each cycle weakening the structure further. Keith's defense pivots toward redemption again. He emphasizes sobriety, therapy, effort. He argues that a marriage spanning nearly 2 decades cannot be reduced to its worst nights. He highlights fatherhood, provision, and moments of genuine connection. He suggests that public narratives exaggerate the darkest episodes while ignoring the years of ordinary partnership. His frustration is not only with Nicole's claims, but with the transformation of private conflict into public indictment. Yet the emotional gravity of Part BA lies less in factual adjudication and more in perception. Nicole's central claim is not merely that he betrayed or intimidated her. It is that she lived in a constant state of vigilance. That love became management, that she shrank herself to keep peace. Whether every allegation holds under scrutiny becomes secondary to how she describes feeling: trapped, exhausted, and invisible. The transcript reinforces this with repeated emphasis on exhaustion. She says she became a shield, a caretaker, a public relations buffer. She describes lying to press to protect his image during rumored relapses. She describes absorbing embarrassment quietly to avoid destabilizing the children. In her narrative, staying was not weakness, it was endurance. And then comes the philosophical pivot. At what point does endurance become complicity? She says the moment she realized staying was teaching her daughters to normalize mistreatment, the calculus changed. The divorce became less about her pain and more about example. She frames signing the papers not as surrender, but as boundary setting. Part BA ultimately transforms the story from romantic collapse into a confrontation about power and selfhood. It asks whether love can survive when one partner feels perpetually responsible and the other feels perpetually judged. It asks whether forgiveness without structural change is sustainable. And it leaves viewers with the most uncomfortable reality of all. Sometimes two people can love each other deeply and still build a dynamic that slowly destroys them both. The courtroom, then, is not just a legal arena. It is a battlefield of memory. Each recollection is weaponized. Each denial is countered by detail. And as the allegations grow heavier, the fairy tale narrative dissolves completely. What remains is not the golden couple on a red carpet, but two individuals fighting over which version of their shared history will become the official one. And in that fight, the truth may be less cinematic than the transcript suggests, but the emotional damage, real or perceived, is undeniable. As the narrative moves into its fourth chapter, the intensity shifts from explosive confrontations to something colder, more calculated, what Nicole describes as the silent betrayal. If Part BA centered on allegations of infidelity and physical intimidation, Part Bond focuses on something quieter, but, in her words, equally devastating. The moment she realized the marriage had already ended in Keith's mind long before it was declared in court. The transcript anchors this turning point to June 2025. According to Nicole's testimony, Keith signed a contract to purchase a $4 million mansion in Nashville. Not a rental. Not a temporary tour stop, a home. And not just any home, one acquired without consultation, discussion, or even notification. At the time, Nicole says she was in London filming Practical Magic High, believing that their separation was circumstantial, rooted in work schedules and space rather than finality. She claims she discovered the purchase not through a conversation with her husband, but through the press. That discovery becomes symbolic. In long marriages, decisions about property are rarely just financial. They are declarations of direction. To Nicole, that signature on a contract represented something more decisive than any argument. She describes reading the article repeatedly, hoping it was incorrect. But the leaked contract bore his signature, bold, final, unambiguous. She frames it as 1,000 small cuts rather than one dramatic wound. Not because buying a house is inherently betrayal, but because it implied a future designed without her. When she called him, she says he initially did not answer. On subsequent attempts, his responses were brief and restrained. "We need space," he reportedly said. In isolation, that phrase sounds almost therapeutic. But in the context of 19 years, children, shared assets, and public speculation, it landed, in her telling, as abandonment. Keith's perspective counters that narrative. He argues the purchase was not secrecy, but practicality. They had been living separately for months. Their communication had deteriorated. The cooling-off period had already begun. He insists the decision was logistical, not symbolic. To him, securing a residence in Nashville, where much of his work and life were rooted, was stability, not betrayal. But perception is everything in a fractured marriage. What one sees as preparation, the other sees as desertion. The transcript then shifts toward the emotional impact on their daughters. Sunday Rose, then 17, reportedly discovered the new house through online headlines before any parental explanation. Faith Margaret, younger and more openly emotional, reacted with visible anger. Nicole recounts a phone call where Sunday asked, "Where do I belong now?" It is a devastating question, not because of legal implications, but because it reveals how children interpret logistics as rejection. Keith pushes back here as well. He emphasizes that he remained present in their lives, that the Nashville property did not equate to emotional absence. He describes continued efforts at co-parenting and communication. Yet even he acknowledges that optics matter. In high-profile marriages, the line between private decision and public narrative dissolves quickly. This chapter also deepens the theme of emotional distance. Nicole describes nights on film sets until early morning hours, scrolling through social media posts of Keith performing before thousands of fans. She says she felt a growing dissonance, not jealousy of success, but alienation from the version of him she saw online. He appeared vibrant, energized, embraced by crowds. Meanwhile, their personal communication had thinned into formal updates and logistical coordination. Keith, in his testimony, frames touring as not escape but identity. Music is his vocation. Performance is where he feels most alive. He argues that Nicole's long filming schedules were equally consuming. Neither partner was wrong for pursuing their craft, he suggests, but somewhere in that pursuit, they stopped aligning their lives intentionally. Careers became parallel tracks instead of shared journeys. One of the most psychologically revealing aspects of this chapter is how both describe silence differently. Nicole interprets his quiet responses during conflict as emotional withdrawal, a refusal to engage. Keith interprets his silence as restraint, a deliberate effort not to escalate tension publicly or privately. This divergence is subtle but profound. In strained relationships, silence can be read as either maturity or indifference, depending on the emotional climate. The transcript introduces the term geographic divorce, used by media outlets to describe couples who live apart long before filing officially. Nicole dismisses it as a sanitized label for emotional severance. She argues that not sharing a home inevitably erodes shared intimacy. Keith counters that many couples navigate dual locations due to work and remain intact. The disagreement underscores a deeper incompatibility. For her, physical separation signaled detachment. For him, it was operational reality. Perhaps the most poignant theme of Part Bond is inevitability. Neither claims that a single event ended the marriage. Instead, there's a sense that the structure weakened incrementally. FaceTime calls became mechanical. Conversations revolve around schedules rather than feelings. Attempts at reconnection, brief vacations, shared public appearances felt increasingly performative rather than restorative. Nicole suggests she held onto hope during the court-mandated 45-day reconsideration period. She imagined him arriving in London, apologizing, seeking repair. Instead, paparazzi photographs depicted him leaving the new Nashville property looking composed, almost liberated. Whether that interpretation reflects reality or projection is unclear, but emotionally, it sealed her conclusion that reconciliation was improbable. Keith's final position in this chapter emphasizes fatigue rather than malice. He describes two people who loved deeply but exhausted each other. He rejects the narrative of strategic abandonment and instead frames the separation as mutual erosion. Love, he implies, can survive addiction, jealousy, and scandal, but not endless misalignment. By the close of Part Bond, the courtroom no longer feels like a battleground over specific allegations. It feels like a reckoning with time. 19 years, 2 daughters, shared history stretching across continents and careers. And beneath it all, a central question: when does staying become denial? When does leaving become honesty? The mansion in Nashville, then, becomes more than real estate. It becomes metaphor, a house built in a new chapter, while the old one still stood, cracked, weathered, and finally acknowledged as unsustainable. And in that acknowledgement lies the quietest tragedy of all. Sometimes the end of a marriage is not marked by a scream, but by a signature. As the narrative enters its 5th chapter, the emotional gravity shifts almost entirely onto the daughters. If the earlier parts revolved around imbalance, betrayal, and separation, Part Nam reframes the divorce through the eyes of Sunday Rose and Faith Margaret. The courtroom drama fades slightly, replaced by a quieter but more devastating question. What did the children absorb while the adults were unraveling? Nicole's testimony in this phase is less accusatory toward Keith and more introspective. She describes motherhood as the one space where her identity felt absolute. When Sunday was born in July 2008, she recalls feeling a clarity that eclipsed career, red carpets, and even marital strain. Holding her first child, she believed she could endure anything. That belief, she suggests, became both her strength and her trap. Because endurance, when extended too long, becomes normalization. She admits that shortly after Sunday's birth, work obligations pulled her back onto film sets. Keith, at the time navigating sobriety and the pressures of public life, remained in Nashville with the baby. On paper, this was partnership. In practice, she says it felt fragile. Addiction recovery demands vigilance. Parenting demands stability. The combination left little room for error. Sunday grew up in a household where love existed, but tension existed alongside it. Fate's arrival in December 2010 via surrogate represented renewal. Nicole testifies that she privately promised herself Faith would experience a calmer childhood. Yet the transcript repeatedly returns to a haunting idea. Children sense emotional fractures long before adults articulate them. Arguments behind closed doors are never as silent as parents believe. Nicole recounts moments that redefined her understanding of the marriage's impact. Faith, at 6 years old, allegedly standing outside a bedroom door during a heated argument. Sunday, sensitive and observant, writing in a journal about her mother crying in private spaces. These details may never be legally verified, but emotionally they resonate. They frame the divorce not as a celebrity headline, but as a generational crossroads. Keith responds by emphasizing his devotion as a father. He acknowledges mistakes within the marriage, but rejects the idea that he was absent or indifferent. He describes returning from tours and immediately seeking out his daughters. He frames his work not as escape, but as provision. In his telling, fatherhood was constant even when marriage faltered. The tension here is subtle but significant. Nicole's narrative suggests emotional inconsistency. Children witnessing volatility, sensing instability. Keith's narrative suggests physical presence and financial support, evidence of commitment. Both perspectives can coexist, and that coexistence complicates the idea of villain and victim. What makes this chapter powerful is not proof of wrongdoing, but proof of consequence. Divorce, especially after nearly 2 decades, is rarely about a single betrayal. It is about cumulative impact. Nicole articulates a pivotal realization. Staying in a fractured marriage might have preserved a public image, but it was teaching her daughters a dangerous lesson. That love requires enduring silence. That loyalty requires self-erasure. That discomfort should be absorbed quietly to maintain structure. She describes a moment during the summer of 2025 when separation had already begun. Sunday, then 17, reportedly stopped asking questions. Her silence, Nicole suggests, felt more condemning than tears. Faith, younger and more expressive, oscillated between anger and denial, drawing family portraits with both parents side by side, even as they lived apart. When Nicole finally told them she had signed the divorce papers, the reaction was not dramatic chaos. It was grief layered with resignation. Sunday reportedly remained composed, her expression older than her years. Faith cried openly, pleading for the family not to fall apart. Nicole admits she had no comforting promises left to offer, only honesty. Keith's response to this portrayal is measured. He insists that separation does not equal abandonment. He emphasizes shared custody discussions, continued involvement, and mutual efforts to protect the girls from media frenzy. He challenges the implication that divorce itself is evidence of paternal failure. In his view, Modeling personal growth and accountability can be equally instructive for children. This exchange introduces a larger philosophical question. Is it more damaging for children to witness marital conflict or to witness the rupture of divorce? There is no universal answer. The transcript suggests Nicole concluded that authenticity outweighed appearance, that demonstrating boundaries was healthier than performing harmony. Partnam also subtly reframes the earlier allegations. Whether addiction, infidelity, or intimidation occurred, as described, becomes secondary to how the children interpreted atmosphere. Emotional climates shape development more than isolated events. Sunday and Faith become less characters and more barometers. There is also an undercurrent of legacy. Both parents are global figures, an Oscar-winning actress and a country music icon. Their public personas are intertwined with narratives of resilience and artistry. Yet in private, they confront a humbling reality. Fame does not shield children from confusion. Nicole's closing emphasis in this chapter is instructive rather than accusatory. She claims the divorce was not an act of destruction, but an act of interruption. An interruption of patterns she feared might otherwise continue. She frames it as choosing truth over performance. Keith, meanwhile, frames it as the painful acceptance that love sometimes changes shape. He resists being cast as antagonist, insisting that human failure is not synonymous with malice. By the end of Part 9, the courtroom setting feels less adversarial and more reflective. The battle is no longer primarily about proving who is right or wrong. It is about defining what kind of example remains for the daughters. And perhaps that is the most sobering realization of this entire saga. Marriages end in courtrooms, but their deepest verdicts are delivered in living rooms, when children quietly decide what love means based on what they witnessed. Whether this divorce represents liberation, failure, or evolution depends on which narrative one believes. But in the eyes of Sunday and Faith, it represents something simpler and heavier, the end of the only version of family they have ever known. By the time the narrative reaches its 6th chapter, the courtroom tension gives way to something more reflective, less about accusation, more about reckoning. The testimony has been delivered. The allegations have been answered. Now what remains is not just a legal separation, but the dismantling of a shared identity that lasted nearly 2 decades. Nicole's tone in this phase shifts from confrontation to clarity. She no longer focuses on specific incidents, rehab, rumors, the Nashville mansion, but on a larger realization. Somewhere along the way, they stopped choosing each other. Not in a dramatic moment, not in one catastrophic betrayal, but in a series of small decisions. Long filming schedules, extended tours, delayed conversations, emotional check-ins replaced by logistical updates. She describes FaceTime calls that felt like business meetings. "How are you?" "I'm fine." Updates about scripts, tour stops, press appearances. But no laughter, no spark, no curiosity. The kind of erosion that happens quietly, where intimacy dissolves not in explosions, but in routine. Keith, in his response, does not deny that distance grew. He admits that touring became an anchor for him. Music was not just career, but identity. On stage, he felt clear, purposeful, understood. Off stage, he often felt scrutinized, compared, and overshadowed. He suggests that their lives began orbiting different centers of gravity. She thrived in transformation, inhabiting characters. He thrived in authenticity, bearing himself through song. Neither was wrong, but alignment requires more than parallel success. Nicole frames the shift differently. She says she began to feel like a visitor in her own marriage. When she watched footage of him performing, thousands of fans singing back every lyric, she felt pride, but also estrangement. The man on stage seemed complete. The man in private seemed unreachable. She insists that what hurt most was not competition, but disconnection. This is where the transcript moves beyond scandal and into psychology. Relationships often fracture not because love vanishes, but because connection weakens. Emotional bids go unanswered. Resentments calcify. Pride replaces vulnerability. Over time, reconciliation requires more effort than separation. Keith's defense becomes philosophical rather than defensive. He argues that growth sometimes pulls partners in different directions, that sobriety, career maturity, and personal evolution can reshape priorities. He does not claim perfection, but he challenges the narrative that evolution equals abandonment. In his view, they both changed and perhaps failed to renegotiate who they were becoming. Nicole counters that change is inevitable, but commitment requires recalibration. She suggests that recalibration never fully happened. They adapted schedules, but not expectations. They coordinated parenting, but not intimacy. They preserved image, but neglected emotional infrastructure. One of the most telling elements in this chapter is how both describe exhaustion. Not anger, not hatred, exhaustion. 19 years of managing careers, raising children, confronting public scrutiny, navigating addiction recovery, addressing insecurity. It accumulates. And when exhaustion sets in, conflict becomes heavier to lift. The concept of geographic divorce resurfaces here, but stripped of media gloss. Living in separate cities, sometimes separate continents, transforms partnership into coordination. They try to bridge it, short vacations, award shows, family gatherings. But each reunion felt temporary. Departures felt heavier. Eventually, departure became default. Keith reflects on pride as a complicating factor. Being married to one of Hollywood's most celebrated actresses brought admiration, but also internal comparison. He admits struggling with public narratives that reduced him to Nicole Kidman's husband. He frames some of his defensiveness not as control, but insecurity. Insecurity, poorly managed, can manifest as withdrawal, silence, even resentment. Nicole acknowledges ambition as her own complicating force. She chose demanding roles. She chased artistic depth. She does not apologize for it, but she concedes that ambition leaves little room for sustained emotional repair when conflict arises. Two driven individuals require intentional reconnection. Without it, independence morphs into isolation. The transcript does not resolve who failed more. Instead, it presents a shared miscalculation, assuming longevity guarantees stability. 19 years can create the illusion that the foundation is indestructible, but foundations require maintenance. By the end of part, Sal the divorce no longer feels like a courtroom battle. It feels like an inevitability born of neglect, mutual, gradual, and unaddressed. Love existed, effort existed, but timing, ego, and exhaustion eroded what affection alone could not preserve. Keith closes this phase by rejecting the villain narrative outright. He insists he loved deeply, stumbled publicly, recovered sincerely, and tried imperfectly. Nicole closes by rejecting martyrdom. She insists she endured as long as she could, but endurance without renewal becomes self-sacrifice. And so the story transitions from blame to acceptance. Not every marriage ends because of dramatic scandal. Some end because two people who once fit seamlessly begin growing in incompatible directions, and neither recognizes the distance until it becomes unbridgeable. By the time the story reaches its final chapter, the courtroom has fallen silent. The accusations have been spoken. The defenses have been delivered. What remains is not spectacle, but consequence. 19 years reduced to a legal decree. Two careers still thriving. Two daughters adjusting to a new definition of home. Nicole's closing position is not triumphant. It is resolute. She frames the divorce not as victory over Keith, but as release from a dynamic she believes no longer served either of them. In her words, the signature on July 15th, 2025 was not surrender, it was boundary. She insists she stayed as long as she could. She fought privately before speaking publicly. But at some point, endurance stops being noble and starts becoming self-erasure. For her, choosing separation was choosing psychological survival. Keith's final stance mirrors that firmness, but with a different emotional register. He refuses the role of villain. He acknowledges addiction, insecurity, imperfection. He admits pride, clouded communication, and that silence often replaced vulnerability. But he maintains that he loved fully, that he changed, and that he did not wake up one day intending to dismantle his family. In his view, the tragedy is not betrayal alone. It is incompatibility that hardened over time. What makes the ending complex is that both narratives can coexist without fully canceling each other. Nicole may have felt unseen. Keith may have felt diminished. She may have experienced exhaustion. He may have experienced humiliation. Relationships rarely collapse under a single weight. They fracture under accumulated strain. The daughters remain the quiet center of gravity. Sunday Rose and Faith Margaret now navigate a reality where holidays are scheduled, homes are divided, and the idea of family is reconstructed rather than inherited. The transcript suggests Nicole hopes the divorce teaches them courage, the courage to leave when boundaries are crossed. Keith hopes it teaches resilience, the understanding that human failure does not erase love. And perhaps that is the final truth of this saga. Divorce does not always erase affection. It redefines it. The love that once sustained a marriage may not survive as partnership, but it can survive as co-parenting, as memory, as shared history. What ends is the structure, not necessarily the care. In the end, the fairy tale dissolves. There is no villain monologue, no dramatic confession that ties every thread neatly together. There are only two people who once believed destiny brought them together, now acknowledging that destiny does not guarantee permanence. The judge signs the order. The case file closes. Kidman versus Urban becomes archived text. But outside the courtroom, life continues. Tours resume. Film sets call. School schedules adjust. And somewhere between public scrutiny and private healing, two individuals begin again, separately. Because sometimes the harshest truth about love is not that it was false. It is that it changed.